Okay, so let's dive into this source material we've got today.
Yeah, it's excerpts from a YouTube video transcript, right?
Exactly. And it's looking really closely at that recent military parade, the one for the U.S. Army's 250th anniversary.
Got it.
So our mission here, really, is to kind of unpack how this source sees it, the perspectives, the criticisms it brings up, and some, really specific details it focuses on.
Right, trying to understand the narrative this particular source is building around the event.
Yeah, what can we sort of glean from this specific take?
Well, what's obvious pretty much immediately is that this source isn't just like describing the parade, it's interpreting it
Mm-hmm.
heavily.
Mm-hmm.
It pulls in commentary, quotes from veterans,
Mm-hmm.
historical bits, all to kind of construct a very specific story about what went down, according to them.
Absolutely. And the source doesn't waste any time setting that critical tone. I mean, the event's framed as the Army's 250th,
Yeah, celebration.
but the source calls it things like dictator parade, dictator birthday parade, even bargain pin parade.
Wow, okay, so critical right out of the gate.
Definitely. And one of the first, big things it dives into is the attendance, the numbers.
Ah, right, the classic attendance debate. Always seems to come up with these things.
Totally. And here you really see the conflicting accounts laid out, at least as the source presents them. You've got the DoD rapid response,
What do they say?
claiming hundreds of thousands, and that they were honored to host hundreds of thousands of proud Americans.
Okay.
And then there's Stephen Chung. The source identifies him as Trump's communication director. He apparently claimed over 250,000 patriots showed up.
So big numbers from the official side or close to it?
But then the source just flat out challenges that. Their estimate is way, way lower,
How low?
like less than 10,000 people, or at most around 10,000 people. That's a huge gap.
Massive difference. And did the source offer any, explanation for that discrepancy?
Well, they actually suggest official photos might have been photoshopped to make the crowd look bigger.
Whoa, okay, that's
Right.
that's a serious accusation for the source to make.
It really is. And to kind of hammer home their point about low turnout, the source brings up another event,
Which one?
the No Kings protest. They report that drew like 5 to 12.5 million people.
Okay, yeah, that's enormous.
And the source explicitly says that protest absolutely dwarfed the parade crowd. So they're using that comparison to frame the parade attendance as, particularly weak in their view.
Right, that contrast is clearly there to reinforce their narrative about the event's lack of popular support compared to other gatherings they bring up.
So, okay, beyond the crowd size, the source spends a lot of time on the performance of the military itself, the quality.
The actual marching and ceremony part.
Yeah, and this section seems to lean really heavily on quotes from veterans that were included in the source material.
Okay, and what were those criticisms like? Based on the source, of course.
Pretty sharp.
Right.
The veterans quoted apparently described soldiers casually strolling, not, marching in lockstep.
Oh, wow. Not what you expect.
No. Sounded like they were phoning it in. Some pretty harsh language was used, according to the source. Looks like the first week of basic training, marching was a horror story. Just walking, nobody's in step.
Oof, that's rough. Especially coming from veterans, as the source presents it.
Yeah, and there were these little details, too, apparently. Like the source mentioned a lead soldier couldn't even muster a proper salute. Or this image of a lone soldier awkwardly holding a DJI drone above his head.
A drone, just holding it.
Yeah, apparently. So the overall vibe from these quotes in the source was that it looked messy, tacky, cheap, and unprofessional. A hot damn mess was one
A
quote.
hot damn mess.
Okay. And another quote from a veteran was, apparently practicing drill and ceremony was not of importance.
It's interesting, though, that the source includes why the veterans felt this way. Not just the criticism, but the context.
What do you mean?
Well, the source mentions them explaining how, marching discipline is drilled into you in basic. It becomes second nature. How soldiers usually know how to self-correct if they get out of step. And how there's typically someone setting the cadence if there isn't, like a commander calling it out.
Ah, okay. So the source uses that to suggest this wasn't just a manner slip-up in the veteran's eyes.
Exactly. It provides that context from within the military culture itself, according to the source's reporting.
And this actually leads the source to float a theory about why it might have looked this way.
Okay. More than just lack of practice.
Yeah. The source suggests it could have been a kind of subtle form of protest within the military.
A protest? How?
Like against being used as props, as the source puts it, in a political event. They call it a silent protest.
Mm.
The source even uses this, like, military-style code. Foxtrot Delta Tango.
Which basically implies
What?
a deliberate screw-up?
Something like that, yeah, like a deliberate failure or non-action. It's presented by the source as, one possible interpretation of what they observed.
That's a really provocative idea the source is putting out there. That perceived sloppiness might have been intentional.
Mm-hmm.
A message.
It is, though it's fair to note the source does mention an exception.
Oh, yeah.
The Army marching bands. They were described as looking pretty tight and squared away.
Ah, okay, so not everything was criticized in the source. That contrast is interesting.
Definitely. Shifting gears a bit, the source also weaves in some other details and points out things it frames as, well, ironies.
Like what?
One big one is the music. Apparently they played Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival during the parade.
Fortunate Son, really,
Yes.
during a military parade.
That's what the source says, and they really lean into this, interpreting the song explicitly as a protest anthem.
Which it famously is, yeah,
Yep.
about class disparity and the Vietnam draft.
Exactly. And the source connects that directly to Donald Trump's history, presents it as deeply ironic.
How so?
Well, the source highlights his 5 draft deferments during Vietnam, including the one for claimed bone spurs.
Right, I remember that coming up.
And the source also includes this other quote attributed to Trump, where he apparently called avoiding STDs in the 80s his personal Vietnam.
Oh, boy. Yeah, the source mentioning that quote alongside playing Fortunate Son.
Is clearly intended by the source to create a sense of irony, yeah, a really pointed juxtaposition.
No kidding. Any other sort of specific observations from the event itself in the source?
There was this mention of the dynamic between Melania and Donald Trump.
Oh, what did the source say?
It described Melania as looking happy, quote, relishing happy as can be at Donald Trump's suffering.
And Trump was suffering.
The source characterized him as suffering or inconsolable during the event.
Huh. That's a very specific behavioral read from the source.
It is. And just briefly, the source also threw in that even the Russians are trolling Donald Trump about the parade.
Suggesting it got some negative international attention, according to this source.
Seems like it. Interestingly, the source also tried to provide some historical context. It brought up World War I.
World War I, how did that connect?
Well, they gave some background, War starts 1914, U.S. neutral, then joins in 1917.
Okay.
The source pointed out how the Army ballooned then from under 138,000 to over 4 million. Huge growth.
Wow, yeah.
And nearly 2 million served in Europe. They listed the casualties too, almost 50,000 killed, 190,000 wounded by the time of the armistice in November 1918.
So highlighting the scale and sacrifice of past efforts.
Seems like it. And they also mentioned something else from that era, the 1919 Transcontinental Moto Convoy.
Okay, what was that?
The source described it as this, epic road trip. A 1918 Dodge touring car went 3,251 miles in 62 days.
Across the country back then.
Yeah, on the Lincoln Highway. And the source stresses the conditions: no pavement, no GPS, obviously no power steering.
Wow, tough journey.
Totally. The source emphasized the grit, determination, and the drive to push Army mobility that it took.
So the source seems to be using these historical points, maybe as a contrast, or just adding context for a discussion about the Army.
It feels like a bit of both, maybe. Setting a backdrop of past military endeavors when discussing this modern parade.
Right, so if we pull back and try to synthesize what this source material gave us.
It's a really critical perspective, isn't it, on this specific parade?
Definitely. The source questions the official story on attendance.
Gives voice to these detailed veteran critiques about the performance.
Raises that whole silent protest possibility.
And highlights these specific details, the song choice, the historical notes, framing them as significant or, ironic.
Yeah, it's a very distinct lens through which the event is viewed in this source.
So I guess the takeaway, or maybe the question this leaves you, the listener, with is...
What does it tell us when public events like this generate such different interpretations?
Right. When you have these competing narratives and sources highlighting very specific, maybe seemingly small details.
How does that shape our understanding? And what might those details, according to the people pointing them out, reveal about the underlying dynamics or tensions at play?
Something to think about, for sure. How these public displays are presented and then represented can really vary.